Today's story is a very creepy one. In fact, it's so bizarre at times that you're probably going to catch yourself thinking, okay, this has to be made up. But the problem is, there's a real thread tied to real names in the hills and bluffs of Richland County, Wisconsin. And by the early 1900s, that thread gets yanked hard enough that people start looking for a place they're not sure they even want to find. It starts with a warning that shouldn't survive generations and ends with a discovery that feels too staged to be natural. So the question is, if the woods really did hide it, why did it ever get found at all? He stopped at the mouth of the cave with the day still clinging to the trees behind him. Not the warm, generous day that made a forest feel like a mother's hand. This was late light, thin and slanting, already leaning away like it had other places to be. It touched the tops of the hills and the shoulders of the pines, but it refused to go into the ravine. Down there, where the air turned cool and damp and wrong, the sun behaved as if it had never existed. The cave's opening looked less like a place you entered, and more like a wound the hillside refused to heal. The young warrior had tracked the boys for miles, 3 sets of prints that should have wandered, stopped, circled, doubled back, argued with themselves the way young hunters did when they got tired or bored or hungry. But these tracks didn't do that. They didn't hesitate. They went as if something had called them. And now the prints went into the dark, and there were no prints coming back out. Behind the warrior, the men he'd brought, 9 of the strongest, the kind who carried calm the way others carried spears, stood in a loose line at the edge of shadow. They didn't speak. They watched him, and they watched the cave, and they listened the way you listen when you're trying not to admit you're afraid. For a moment, the warrior told himself the simplest thing. They're inside. They're hurt. They're embarrassed. They're stubborn. We'll find them. Then he leaned forward and called the first name into the cave. His voice went in and came back in pieces. Not an echo like a shout off a cliff. This was a softer return, as if the cave swallowed the sound, chewed it, and offered it back without care. No answer. He called again, sharper this time, and he could feel his own pulse behind his eyes. His hands were steady, but the steadiness was the kind you forced into your fingers, the way you forced your posture at a funeral. Still nothing. So he did what leaders do when they can't afford panic. He chose 2 men. Go in, he told them. Not far. Call out. Look for sign. Come back. The 2 didn't argue. They stepped past him and into the mouth of the cave, and the darkness accepted them like water accepts stones. For a little while, the warrior could still see their shapes, shoulders, hair, the pale blink of an arm lifting as they called the boys' names. Their voices traveled back to the entrance, bouncing off stone, thinning as they went deeper. Then their outlines dissolved. Then their voices did too. It wasn't the sudden stop of a man deciding to be quiet. It was a severing, a clean cut. The cave went still. The warrior waited 5 minutes, then 10, then 15, standing there with 7 men behind him, and the forest around them behaving like the forest always behaved. Leaves moved, birds called. Somewhere higher up, wind passed through needles like fingers through hair. And yet the opening stayed black, and nothing returned. When a man is taught from childhood that bravery is a kind of duty, fear doesn't arrive like a scream. It arrives like cold water poured slowly into your ribs. The warrior stepped just inside the cave, only far enough that the daylight behind him dimmed. He called the 2 men's names. His voice echoed down corridors he couldn't see. At first, there was nothing. Then something came back, a sound like wailing. a long, unsteady note that seemed to come from far away, the way an animal's cry can sound like a person if you're tired enough. For an instant, his mind tried to label it as grief, as pain, as a man falling. But it wasn't one voice. It became two, then more, layered, rhythmic, and the warrior's stomach tightened because he understood the shape of it before he wanted to. It was a chant. Not just any chant. It was their chant. The song the Ho-Chunk warriors sang when death was close enough to be honest about. The death song. Behind him, the 7 men heard it too. They surged forward, breath catching, hands lifting as if they could grab sound itself and pull their brothers back. "What do we do?" one of them hissed, and it wasn't a question meant for words. It was the oldest human question there was. Before the warrior could answer, 6 of them ran into the darkness. Their footfalls thudded, then softened, then disappeared, swallowed by the turn of the tunnel. Their voices followed, calling, calling, calling. Names, pleas, commands, all of it bouncing into the depths and returning broken. The death song continued, steady, like a drum you couldn't see. Then it stopped. Not fading, not winding down. Stopping. The cave went dead again. The warrior stood at the threshold with only one man left beside him now, and the absence behind the silence felt like something leaning forward in the dark, listening. A moment passed. Another. Then, without warning, the death song started again, louder, fuller, unmistakably many voices now, as if an entire gathering had formed somewhere deep in the stone. The warrior felt his own body respond in ways he hated. The hair along his arms rising, his mouth drying, the instinct to run scratching at his ribs like an animal trapped inside him. This was the point where duty and logic began to fight. Duty said, "Go in. If they die, you die with them. That is what you were made for." Logic said, "If you go in now, you will not come out. And if you do not come out, there will be no one left to tell the village where the cave is. There will be no rescue. There will only be a hole in the earth that eats men and keeps the secret." The death song kept coming over and over, a rhythm meant for final breath and brave faces, except this time it sounded wrong, like the cave had learned the tune but not the meaning. The warrior looked at the man beside him. In the dim light at the entrance, the man's eyes were wide, the whites showing. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They turned and ran. They ran up the ravine, lungs burning, feet slipping in loose soil, then across miles of forest, past familiar trails, past the places where deer moved at dusk, past the quiet places where a hunter could sit and listen to his own thoughts. They ran until the village lights, fires, lamps, the glow of people, rose through the trees like salvation. When they reached the center, they were barely men anymore, just bodies that had returned without their souls fully catching up. The chief listened without interrupting. He didn't accuse. He didn't demand explanations that couldn't exist. When the warrior finished, when he admitted, through clenched shame, that he had left men in the cave, the chief's face tightened, not in anger, but in the weight of what leadership meant. "Tomorrow," the chief said, voice low, "first light. We go back." And he said it the way you say something you must do even when you know it may change you forever. At first light, the village moved as one. Not a handful of warriors this time, nearly 100 people, fathers and brothers, uncles and cousins, men who had hunted and fought and carried the stories of their ancestors, and a few who came because love makes you reckless. They retraced the path through the forest, down the ravine, to the cave mouth. The entrance looked the same as it had the evening before. Black, patient, indifferent. The tracks were still there. Lines of footprints going in, none coming out. No scuffs, no signs of struggle near the mouth. Nothing to suggest a bear, nothing to suggest a fight. It was as if the cave simply convinced men to enter and then erase them. The warrior, now no longer steady in his certainty, only steady in his guilt, waited for the chief's plan. The chief spoke in a voice designed to hold a crowd together. "We do not go in one by one," he said. "We do not split. We do not let the cave take us in pieces." He had them form a single line, hands clasped. Every person holding the next, a chain of warmth and flesh meant to defy the cold geometry of stone. Never let go. The other man, the one who had run back with the warrior the night before, stood at the front. The warrior stood second, close enough to feel the front man's wrist bones under his grip. Behind them, the line stretched into the daylight like a living rope. They entered. For the first few steps, there was still light. The cave mouth allowed them that mercy. The tunnel carried them forward a few dozen feet, and then it bent sharply to the right. Past the bend, the world ended. No sun, no sky, no trees, only stone and breath and the soft shuffle of feet. The warrior blinked hard, trying to force his eyes to pull shape from dark. But darkness in a cave wasn't like night. It had weight. It sat on your eyelids. It pressed against your face. The front man called names into the black. No response. Their chain moved forward slowly, carefully. The walls tightened. The air cooled. Somewhere, water dripped at a steady pace that made time feel like a sentence. Then, from deeper inside, the death song began again. Low at first, a distant rhythmic chant, as if it came from behind a far wall. It grew louder, and the sound did something strange. It felt less like it traveled through air and more like it traveled through bone. The men in the line felt it in their ribs, in their teeth. The front man kept moving, still calling, voice tight now. The warrior tried to squeeze the hands he held, front and back, communicating without language. "Stay with me, keep breathing, keep going." Then he felt the front man's grip loosen, not the gradual relaxation of a tired hand. A slackening, a release. The warrior tightened his own fingers instantly, trying to clamp down, trying to catch the hand before it slipped away. But the hand was gone. It was as if it had been pulled forward and removed cleanly, without struggle. The warrior reached into the black, arm extended, fingers grasping for skin. Nothing. No body, no breath, no sound of a man stumbling. Only the death song, louder now, a chorus rising. The warrior became the first in line without choosing it. He wanted to shout, "Turn back." He wanted to rip his hand free and run. He wanted to tear the chain apart, if that meant saving anyone. But he felt something else then. Subtle at first, like the tug of a current. A pull forward, not a hand on his back, not a shove. A force of inevitability. And before he could stop himself, before he could decide whether it was fear or something worse, his mouth opened. His voice joined the chant. The death song rose from his throat as if it had been waiting there. Behind him, people began to murmur in alarm. He heard the line tighten, bodies pressing closer, hands sweating in each other's grips. Outside the cave, the chief had stayed with a few others, listening at the mouth. At first, the sounds from inside were muffled, the normal noise of many bodies moving through stone. Then something changed. The cave's interior filled with panic, a swelling disturbance like a crowd suddenly realizing the floor isn't solid. And then the line broke. People exploded out of the mouth of the cave into daylight, faces pale, eyes wide, hands flailing as if still trapped in darkness. They didn't come out as a chain. They came out as survivors of something they couldn't name. The chief tried to stop them, to ask questions, to impose order, but fear doesn't respect rank. Fear moves through a group like fire. When the last of them stumbled out, the chief did what chiefs always do when chaos ends. He counted. And when he finished counting, his face hardened. More than a dozen were missing. Gone, taken from the line, erased from the world behind the bend. The cave was quiet now. The death song was silent again, and the silence felt like satisfaction. The chief looked at the cave mouth for a long time. The warrior, still alive, still breathing, still sick with shame, stood among the shaken crowd. Someone whispered, "It's evil." The word wasn't an accusation. It was an attempt at shape, an attempt to draw a boundary around the unexplainable. The chief made his decision. No one would enter again. If the cave wanted men, it would not be fed. They went back to the village, carrying nothing but absence. They went back to families who asked for bodies and received only a story that didn't make sense. Days passed. Weeks. No one emerged from the cave. No footsteps returned. No voices answered from the mouth. The missing remained missing in the worst way. Without the certainty of death. Without the mercy of a grave. And because people are not built to live inside uncertainty forever, the village finally did the only thing it could do that resembled control. Months later, the chief ordered the entrance sealed. Boulders were dragged and stacked, stone upon stone, until the cave mouth disappeared behind a wall that looked, from a distance, like part of the hillside. They made it a tomb without bodies. They buried not only the missing men, but the question of what had happened. And the story became what stories become when time does what it does. It grew roots. It was told in winter, when the wind made the walls speak. It was told to children who learned early that the world had places you didn't go, no matter how curious you were. It was told with the same ending every time. The cave took them, and the cave never gave them back. The location was kept quiet, guarded by fear and by respect. Then generations passed, then more. The forest changed. Trails shifted. People moved. Names faded. Eventually, the cave became a thing you spoke of without being able to point, a warning without a map. And then, long after the chief who sealed it was dust, someone found the stone pile again. In 1930, Paul Seifert went into the hills the way he always did. He was an antique dealer by trade, the kind who knew the difference between something old and something merely worn. He liked objects with stories attached to them. Arrowheads, bits of pottery, small things that once mattered in someone else's hands. The woods of Richland County were familiar to him, but he didn't stay on the beaten path. He went where the ground wasn't softened by other feet. That day, he dropped into a ravine and followed it down until the trees thinned into a small clearing. On the opposite slope, something caught his eye. A mound of rocks, not a natural fall of stone, not the scattered randomness of a hillside. This was stacked, intentionally. Grass and moss had tried to make it disappear, but the shape of purpose remained. Seifert climbed to it and began to pull stones away. At first, he worked like a man unstacking a wall. Then he started to realize what it was. A ceiling. Someone had wanted whatever lay behind the stones to stay behind them. His curiosity, which had always been his strength and his weakness, tightened into determination. By the time he had cleared enough rock to expose the opening, he knew it was a cave. The mouth was narrow, half-choked by rubble. It did not invite him. It did not threaten him either. It simply existed, waiting. He couldn't get in that day. Not fully, not safely. So he left, went home, gathered supplies, and returned with a lantern. He came back another day, alone, because the places where you might find the best relics are the places other men avoid. Inside, the cave ran straight for a while, and then turned sharply to the right. It was like stepping out of the world. The light behind him fell away. The lantern became the only sun. He moved carefully, breathing shallowly, listening to the way his own footsteps sounded too loud. The ceiling began to descend, forcing him into a crouch, then a crawl. Stone pressed close. The air grew stale. The deeper he went, the more certain he became that no one else had been here in a long time. And yet he felt, without understanding why, that he was not the first person to be afraid in this place. He crawled beneath a low shelf of rock, his chest scraping the ground, lantern held out in front like an offering. Then the tunnel opened, not gradually. Suddenly, a grand space swallowed him, a chamber so large his lantern light couldn't find its edges right away. The ceiling rose high overhead. The air changed, cooler, wider, as if the cave itself took a deep breath. Seifert stood, stiff-legged, blinking, raising the lantern, and the light found the floor. At first he saw shapes, too many shapes, neat rows of them. Then his mind, refusing the truth for a heartbeat, tried to label them as driftwood, as stones, as some natural pattern. But they were not stones. They were human skeletons, arranged, kneeling as if frozen mid-prayer, dozens upon dozens, so many that counting them would have felt obscene. They all faced the same direction, arms angled forward as if reaching. Seifert's mouth open, but no sound came out. His body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. The lantern trembled slightly in his hand. He followed the line of their posture, shining the light where they seemed to look. And there, carved into the rock face itself, was something that made his throat tighten. A chair, a throne-like formation in stone, large enough that it felt ceremonial, deliberate, and it was empty. The emptiness was the worst part because it suggested occupancy, not now, but at some point. It suggested a missing presence, the way a warm bed suggests someone just rose from it. Seifert didn't step closer. He didn't search for artifacts. He didn't reach down to touch bone. Whatever he'd come here for, money, curiosity, the thrill of being the man who found something no one else had found, collapsed inside him. He turned. He moved fast, awkwardly, because fear makes you clumsy. He crawled back under the low shelf, lantern scraping rock, breath coming sharp and tight. He didn't stop until he was out in daylight again, lungs gulping air that suddenly smelled like freedom. Outside, the ravine looked normal. Birds moved in the branches. Wind slid through leaves. It was the same world he'd left an hour ago, but he was not the same man. For days after, the image stayed with him in flashes. Rows of kneeling bones, the stone throne, the sensation of standing in a chamber too big for a human being's peace. He did what people often do when they see something that doesn't fit into their life. He told someone. Seifert contacted a local newspaper and described what he had found. A sealed cave, a vast chamber, skeletons arranged in a ritual posture, an empty throne carved from rock. The story spread, braided immediately with older whispers, ho-chunk warnings, the legend of men swallowed by a cave, the death song echoing where daylight could not go. And then, as stories often do, it grew larger than the man. Because once you put a tale like that into the world, it stops being yours. People tried to locate the cave. They tried to prove it. They tried to find the exact ravine, the exact bluff, the exact turn to the right where the dark began. But the woods kept their own counsel. The hills didn't offer directions. And a place sealed by hands long gone, then half opened, then abandoned again, could disappear back into the land with frightening ease. Years turned. Seifert died, and with him went whatever private details he'd held. Precise landmarks, the angle of the ravine, the way the light hit the rocks, the small choices that lead you to a hidden mouth in the earth. After his death, the search continued anyway. People came with maps and lanterns and the hunger to be the one who finally pinned myth to a coordinate. Some returned with scraped knees and dirty hands and nothing else. Some returned with stories that sounded like excuses. Some didn't speak much at all. And the legend remained what it had always been, a question that refused to behave, because the unanswered parts were still there, waiting like stone. What happened to the first people who went in? And who or what was meant to sit on that throne? The tangible truth was simple enough. A real 1930 newspaper account existed, tied to a real name, in a real county, describing a cave legend that would not die. But the residue, the part that wouldn't resolve, was the same as it had been in the beginning. A place in the Wisconsin hills that seemed to collect footsteps and keep them. A song meant for warriors at the edge of death, echoing from a depth that did not echo back anything else. And an empty seat in the dark, carved as if it had always been waiting for someone to come home. This was Midnight Horror Society, dark curiosity for sleep. Until your next midnight session, sleep well.